I found the shoebox of high 8 tapes tucked behind the false bottom of my mother's jewelry armoire the day after her funeral. That little black cassette with its peeling label scrawled in her shaky cursive would dismantle my brother's forged ownership of our family store, land him in a courtroom, and eventually place him on a felt-lined polishing bench in the back of a shop I would rename Forged in Greed Jewelers, wearing a custom silk tie that reads Heir of Deception in gold thread, while every appraisal certificate that feeds through my printer carries a footnote citing the case number of his perjury conviction. The tape was hidden so cleverly that even I, who had spent 2 decades in that store learning to see what others miss, nearly overlooked the compartment entirely. But I didn't, and that is why I am not the one in handcuffs today. My name is Claire, and for as long as I can remember, my world smelled of Brasso and old velvet. I could date a Victorian brooch by its clasp alone, could look at the fluorescence pattern of a diamond under ultraviolet light, and know whether it came from a South African mine or a lab crucible. I knew that a real sapphire feels slightly cooler against the skin than a synthetic one, and I could spot a laser-drilled inclusion under 10-power magnification before the customer even finished his sentence. My fingers could reset a loose prong blindfolded, the way a violinist finds middle C without sight, because my mother had taught me that the metal remembers the heat of your hands if you respect it. The store, Beacon Hill Estate Jewelers, had been my mother Elena's whole life before it became mine too. She taught me everything, not just the gemology and the metalwork, but how to read a person across the counter, how to see the tiny flicker of desperation in a woman pawning her grandmother's pearls, and how to offer dignity alongside a fair price. My brother Mark never learned any of that. He was the golden child who would breeze in twice a year, filch a handful of business cards to impress a date, and leave without ever getting polishing rouge under his fingernails. My husband David, a quiet electrical engineer who spent his days designing circuit boards that would later power the security systems I'd need, anchored me through the storm. But in those first raw days after Mom collapsed in the stockroom and never woke up, I was a ship without a rudder. The funeral was barely over before the vultures landed. Mark arrived in a rented Escalade that still had the temporary registration taped to the back window, his wife Vanessa beside him, a former local pageant runner-up, whose entire personality had been airbrushed into an Instagram filter of perpetual perfection. She wore a black dress that had never seen a grieving woman, the kind of garment with sharp shoulders, and a slit that required strategic posing, and she patted my arm with the precise pressure of someone practicing empathy in a mirror. Mark spoke about closure and moving forward, his eyes cataloguing the shop's antique display cases as if pricing the fixtures for an estate sale. By the following morning, they had already produced a laminated to-do list titled Estate Transition Plan, the plastic edges still warm from the office supply store's laminator. I remember staring at that word, transition, as though Mom's 40-year legacy was a subway transfer. The list had bullet points: secure keys from Claire, inventory stock for liquidation, contact county recorder re-deed transfer, and the final item underlined twice, obtain Claire's signature on all docs. While they argued with the funeral home over an itemized bill, nickel-and-diming the cost of the floral arrangements as if my mother's farewell deserved a coupon code, I slipped away to Mom's bedroom, seeking anything of hers that still held the ghost of her lily-of-the-valley perfume. Her jewelry armoire stood in the corner, a towering walnut beast with 36 tiny drawers, each one a kingdom of velvet trays. I knew most of them intimately from years of helping her categorize earring backs and watch crowns, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor while she hummed old standards. But the 7th drawer on the left, the one that held nothing but a jumble of old clasps and broken watch bands, felt different that day. I pulled it all the way out, its felt lining worn thin at the corners, and pressed the back panel with my thumb. There was a faint click, the sound of a hidden latch releasing that only years of handling antique jewelry boxes would have taught me to recognize. A false bottom. My heart punched against my ribs like a wild bird trapped in a cage. Inside lay an ordinary shoebox, the kind that once held a pair of sensible pumps, embossed with the logo of a long-closed department store. But inside the box was not shoes. It was a single high 8 tape, a format so outdated I hadn't seen one since the 90s, its black casing slightly warped from years of Florida humidity. Nestled next to it was a small brass key with a round bow, the kind that opens a safe deposit box, and a folded sheet of cream stationery bearing my mother's monogram in raised gold. Just then, I heard Mark's heavy footsteps in the hallway, the distinctive cadence of his loafers that always struck the floorboards heel first. He appeared in the doorway, his shadow falling across the armoire like a stain, and saw the barks in my hands. His face flickered with something alarmingly close to panic, the skin around his eyes tightening for a half-second before settling into practiced condescension. He plucked the barks from my fingers, glanced inside without even lifting the tape, and snorted. "Old videotapes. Mom was such a packrat. This is junk, Claire." He walked it directly to the heavy black trash bag they had brought from the kitchen, the one now bulging with wilted sympathy lilies and coffee grounds, and dropped it in with a thud that seemed to echo much longer than it should have. "We have real things to deal with. Come help Vanessa sort the trust papers." I nodded meekly, letting my shoulders droop, letting my eyes film over with the gauze of grief. The moment he turned his back, I memorized the precise position of that box in the trash bag, its corner poking up through a layer of grounds like a grave marker. 2 hours later, when they left to meet their lawyer, I retrieved it. The bag was sticky with day-old brew and the cloying scent of decaying petals, but I pulled the box free, wiped it clean with a kitchen towel, and carried it to my car as if it were a balm. My hands trembled as I pulled out the tape and the letter. The note was dated just 6 weeks before she died, the ink slightly smudged where a teardrop might have fallen, but the handwriting still steady. It began with 5 words that turned my blood to ice. "Claire, do not trust them." I read on, my mother's voice ringing clear from the cream-colored page. "If you are reading this, I am gone. Mark and Vanessa have been circling like sharks since my diagnosis. He has already tried to forge my signature on a loan application. I recorded him admitting it years ago when he thought no one was listening. The evidence is on this tape, copied from a hidden nanny cam I paid a friend to install in his apartment after I grew suspicious. Destroy him if you must, but whatever you do, save yourself and what I built. I love you more than rubies and gold. Veritas vincit." That final phrase, Latin for truth conquers, was underlined twice, and I knew it was more than a motto. It was a key. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed can forge anything but the truth. There was no easy way to play a high 8 tape in an era of streaming. The next morning I told Mark I needed to run errands, drove 45 minutes to a vintage electronics shop in a strip mall wedged between a laundromat and a payday loan store, and bought a refurbished Sony Handycam with a working playback deck. The device was clunky, its plastic casing yellowed with age, and the battery held only a whisper of charge from the shop owner's quick test. I plugged it into the cigarette lighter adapter in my car and sat in the parking lot of a shuttered video rental store whose neon sign still promised new releases in cracked red tubes. The humid Florida air fogged my windshield as I fumbled with the tiny eject button and slid the cassette into its carriage. The pop-out screen flickered, stripes of static crawling across the picture like tangled thread, then a grainy figure resolved into my brother, 10 years younger, sprawled on a leather sofa with a bottle of beer balanced on his stomach. The audio crackled but was unmistakable. He was talking to a man off-camera, a friend from college maybe, his words slurred with the kind of arrogance that requires no audience but itself. "Dude, I'm telling you I already did it. I practiced her signature for months. The E in Elena loops twice, see? I got it perfect. The notary is my buddy from the gym, he stamps whatever I put in front of him. When the old bat finally croaks, the whole store is mine. Claire won't know what hit her." He laughed, a sound like a cheap watch being ground under a heel, and crushed the beer can against his forehead. The timestamp in the corner showed March of 2013, a full decade before my mother's death. He hadn't just planned it recently, he had been plotting my dispossession while Mom was still healthy, while I was working 60-hour weeks to keep the business profitable, building relationships with estate attorneys and auction houses, while he was off failing upward in a series of sales jobs that never lasted 6 months. I replayed the tape 3 times, memorizing every syllable, watching the way his mouth formed the words, "forge my signature," with the casualness of someone ordering a pizza. Then I hid the cassette and the note inside a tampon box in my overnight bag, the one place neither Mark nor Vanessa would ever think to look, and I walked back into their world ready to become the Harlow woman they expected. The manipulation began in earnest that evening. They sat me down in their rented living room, the air conditioning so aggressive I could see my breath, Vanessa pouring tea from a porcelain pot with a sympathetic tilt of her head that never reached her eyes. Mark slid a manila folder across the glass coffee table, the contents flagged with colored sticky notes in a system that was meant to look organized, but was really designed to overwhelm. Inside were documents, each one a trap with a spring-loaded hinge. The top document was a durable power of attorney that granted him the authority to sell real property, liquidate brokerage accounts, endorse checks, and sign any instrument in my name, the legal equivalent of handing a stranger the keys to my entire life, and then locking myself out. A second page contained a waiver of my inheritance rights, drafted in dense legalese that used phrases like "in consideration of" and "hereby relinquishes," but with a highlighted line where I was supposed to initial. He told me I had sacrificed enough, that I deserved to step back and let him handle everything, that Mom would want me to rest now. I saw the trap clearly, a forged signature on one page to prime the pump, a surrender of my whole birthright on another, all wrapped in the velvet glove of fake concern. But I had worked retail for 20 years. I knew how to handle customers who thought they were smarter than me. I let my face go slack, my eyes glassy and unfocused, the way an opal clouds when it's been treated with too much heat. I murmured that I wasn't thinking straight, that my head felt stuffed with cotton, that maybe tomorrow would be better. Vanessa cooed and patted my hand, her gel nails clicking against my knuckles, while Mark's jaw tightened until the tendons stood out like cables. She offered me chamomile tea, pressing the warm mug into my palms with a whisper that it would calm my nerves. I brought it to my lips and paused. The honey was thick and raw, but beneath it lay a bitter chemical undertone, the telltale taste of crushed sedatives that my mother, who had worked with a compounding pharmacist for her own arthritis medication, had taught me to recognize. I let the liquid wet my lips but swallowed none of it, then tilted the mug carefully so the rest disappeared into the parted ficus behind my chair, the soil darkening as they exchanged a glance of strained patience. They pressed a pen into my fingers, a heavy silver-plated thing with my mother's initials engraved on the clip, probably stolen from her desk. I let it wobble and fall. Mark's knuckles went white. "Tomorrow," he said, the word a thin blade. That night, I lay awake cataloguing every threat I'd seen in the folder, planning my next move. The next morning, after a breakfast of cold pastries and colder silences, Vanessa announced that they couldn't bear to leave me alone in my grief, that I should come stay with them for a few weeks, recover, regroup. The invitation arrived wrapped in the language of compassion, but delivered with the finality of a subpoena. They had already cleared out the guest suite, she said, and my things would be moved that afternoon. I knew it was a cage, but caged birds hear everything, and the hinges on my cage door were already oiled with my own deception. So I packed my bag, tampon barks carefully zipped into the lining alongside a small leather case of lockpicks I'll tell you about later, and moved into the guest suite of their sprawling McMansion with its fake Tuscan columns and a mortgage that was, I would later learn, 4 months in arrears. The guest suite was a converted storage room at the end of a long hallway, the walls freshly painted but still smelling faintly of drywall dust and something else, something sharper like mildew. There was a deadbolt on the outside of the door, installed backward, I noticed, so that it could lock from the hallway, and a window that had been painted shut. The first night I lay in the dark listening through the vent grill that connected my room to the living area, the metal duct carrying their voices with the clarity of a Tinken telephone. They argued about a lien, their voices rising and falling in a pattern I'd come to know as the rhythm of financial desperation. Mark's voice was sharp with panic, the consonants clipped, while Vanessa's was reedy with blame. "You said the bridge loan would cover it," she hissed. "The bridge loan was supposed to be temporary, but you bought the boat." He fired back, and I heard the slap of a paper hitting the table. I memorized the words bridge loan, balloon payment, encumbered asset. I filed them away like loose gemstones I would later set into a crown of evidence. I became a ghost in their house, the kind that leaves no footprints but sees everything. I observed the way their mail piled up, unopened on a brass tray in the foyer, the way Mark's phone buzzed constantly with calls he took in the backyard, pacing in tight circles around the koi pond that had no koi, just a green film of neglect on the water's surface. I made a habit of standing near the kitchen window that overlooked the patio, pretending to wash dishes while I listened, the sponge motionless in my hand. I caught words like commercial refinance, cross-collateralization, and interest rate reset. He was leveraging the store, using forged documents that bore my supposedly notarized signature, to secure a high-interest bridge loan from a lender that specialized in quick cash for desperate borrowers, the kind of place with a website that promised no credit check, no problem. The term sheet I glimpsed on his desk later, after I'd learned to move through the house like vapor, confirmed it. A 2-year loan at 14%, interest-only payments of nearly $8,000 a month, with a balloon of the full principal due at 18 months. He had already missed 2 payments, and the penalty rate had kicked in, accruing interest daily at a default rate of 22%, compounding monthly. Vanessa, meanwhile, ordered artisanal candles, organic cashmere throws, and $1,000 shoes from boutique websites that shipped in boxes tied with satin ribbons, blissfully unaware that the credit card company had started sending decline notices. I found one of those notices buried in the recycling bin, a thin envelope from a platinum card issuer informing her that her purchasing power had been reduced due to suspicious spending patterns and a recent delinquency. I photographed it with my phone, the macro lens capturing the account number and the bank's logo, then tucked the original inside the lining of my toiletries bag, which was quickly becoming a small archive of their recklessness. Every receipt I could lift from the trash, every torn envelope fragment, every hushed phone call I could overhear, I catalogued like a forensic accountant building a case, which is exactly what I was. The first concrete step in my counter-investigation came when a kitchen cabinet door fell off its hinges. The house was all grandiose facade and no craftsmanship, contractor-grade particle board covered in a veneer of affluence that peeled at the corners like a sunburn. Mark tried to reattach the hinge with a butter knife, the serrations grinding against the screw head, and only gouged the wood, splinters flying like tiny accusations. He cursed and threw the knife into the sink with a clatter. Vanessa stood back, her manicured fingers hovering uselessly, her default expression of mild distaste settling into place. I saw my opening, the first crack in the armor of their assumed superiority. I said calmly, "Let me try. I have steady hands." I retrieved my jeweler's toolkit from my bag, the compact leather case I had used for years to repair delicate filigree earrings, antique pocket watches with hair-thin springs, and the occasional 18th century brooch whose pin had rusted shut. Inside were miniature screwdrivers with precision ground tips, each blade no wider than a grain of rice, a set of tiny awls, and my favorite tool, a jeweler's loop that could magnify 30 times. I selected a slot head driver with a 2mm blade, aligned the hinge plate against the wood, and set the screws in 30 seconds, the tool spinning with the familiarity of an extension of my own fingers. They watched, mouths slightly open, the way people watch a street magician produce a coin from thin air. That was the moment they realized I was not just the weepy sister, the emotional custodian of the family's past. I was someone who could fix things, who had a domain of competence they could never touch, and that scared them in ways they couldn't articulate. From that day on, I noticed Mark glance at me differently, a sliver of wariness flickering behind his eyes like a faulty bulb, and I knew the game was shifting in my favor. A few nights later, after they had gone to bed and the house settled into the low hum of its overworked HVAC, I slipped into the hallway in my bare feet, the carpet muffling my steps. The door to Mark's home office was locked, a basic interior doorknob model, a quickset that any motivated amateur with a credit card might defeat, but I had a more elegant method. My mother had run a jewelry store for 40 years, and part of that trade meant dealing with vintage safe deposit boxes, antique display case locks, and the occasional estate safe whose combination had been lost to time, the dial worn smooth by decades of worried thumbs. I knew the feel of a tension wrench in my fingers like a pianist knows middle C. In my bag, I had a small leather case of lockpicks, originally purchased from a locksmith supply catalogue for opening jewelry boxes, whose keys had been lost to generations, little brass puzzles with 3-pin tumblers or simple wafer locks. I had spent countless evenings practicing on a transparent acrylic practice cylinder, feeling each pin click through the pick like a tiny heartbeat, learning the subtle feedback of a binding driver pin versus one that was simply stuck due to manufacturing tolerance. I knelt, selected a short hook with a profile like a question mark and a medium torsion wrench with a twisted end for better control, and inserted the wrench into the keyway, applying the lightest tension, just enough to turn the plug a fraction of a degree. I raked the pins with the hook in a gentle scrubbing motion, feeling each one lift and then catch on the shear line. Within 45 seconds I felt the sweet give of the plug rotating, the cylinder turning with a soft, satisfying snick that was music to me. I eased the door open, stepped inside the dark office and closed it quietly behind me, my heart beating a steady, disciplined rhythm. This was my element, the hidden spaces where secrets are kept, and I was no longer a grieving daughter but a jeweler of truth, examining every facet for flaw. Against the wall stood a 4-drawer metal filing cabinet, battleship grey and solid, but it too was locked. This lock was a wafer style, slightly corroded from the humidity, its keyway gritty. I switched to a ball pick, a tiny steel sphere on a thin stalk, and increased the tension, feeling each wafer drag against the cylinder walls and then snap into place one by one, like the tumblers of a safe aligning. It took almost 2 minutes, my breath shallow, sweat beading on my forehead despite the air conditioning, but the cabinet drawer finally slid open without a scratch. The bottom drawer contained a hanging folder labeled Beacon Hill Transition in Mark's blocky handwriting, the same handwriting that used to forge birthday cards from Santa when we were kids. My heart beat a military cadence as I spread the documents on his desk and used the narrow beam of my phone's flashlight, filtered through my fingers to keep the light low and focused. There it was. A forged deed of trust, dated 18 months prior, purporting to transfer ownership of the store's building into a shell LLC called Terrace Holdings, an entity I had never heard of, the registered agent a P.O. Box in a strip mall. My name was signed on the acknowledgement page with a notary seal, my signature laughably wrong. The upstroke on my capital C was missing the characteristic loop I always made, a tiny flourish I'd developed in high school when I practiced my cursive during study hall, and the lowercase e closed improperly, like a fist that couldn't quite clench. I could have authenticated it in my sleep. Alongside the deed were promissory notes tying the store's accounts receivable and inventory as collateral for a loan of $240,000 from a lender called Coastal Bridge Capital, the same name I'd overheard during their arguments. The collection letters clipped to the back were printed on letterhead that looked designed in Microsoft Word, and they showed the loan was already 90 days delinquent, with a notice of default filed. Then I found, tucked behind a false divider in the same folder, a hand-drawn timeline on a yellow legal pad. It was a Gantt chart of my destruction. Phase 1, drain the business's liquid assets, approximately $90,000 in cash reserves and pending consignment sales from estate pieces we'd appraised. Phase 2, file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection to stall creditors and lock me out of the decision-making process. Phase 3, leave me holding the tax liability because the bankruptcy would list me as the responsible party due to the forged signatures, which would make me personally liable for the unpaid business taxes. In the margin he had scribbled, "Claire is clueless. She'll sign the POA next week." Next to it was a sticky note with a phone number for a bankruptcy attorney named R. Dietz and a quote for a retainer of $7,500. I photographed every page slowly, methodically, using a macro lens attachment on my phone that could capture the grain of the paper, the pressure indentations from his pen, and the subtle striations of the toner from his cheap laser printer. As I was reassembling the folder, a different document slid out from the back, heavier bond paper with a watermark, the letterhead of a law firm I recognized. Garrison and Hughes, the firm that had drafted my mother's original will 2 decades ago and had sent us Christmas cards every year with a hand-signed note from the senior partner. It was a copy of an amendment to Mom's revocable trust, executed 3 years before her death, and it bore a notary seal that was undeniably genuine, the embossing crisp and deep. I read it twice, and a glow of fierce admiration for my mother flooded through me. The amendment contained a clause so specific, so perfectly engineered, that it could only have been designed for this exact scenario. It stated that any attempt by any heir other than me to encumber, sell, or transfer the real property or the business assets of Beacon Hill Estate Jewelers within 5 years of Alina's death, without my physical presence and notarized consent, would trigger an automatic reversion of all such assets to me free and clear, with no encumbrance or lien. Furthermore, the trustee, Mr. Albert Garrison himself, was empowered to initiate immediate legal action to undo such transfers and freeze the perpetrator's access to all jointly held accounts. There was a clause requiring that any such reversion be executed with the full cooperation of law enforcement as necessary. It was a dead man's switch, a legal tripwire that my mother had set long before she got sick, and the only requirement was that I had to formally contest the forgery and present proof of fraudulent intent. My mother had known. She had armored her legacy with a clause so airtight that even a forged signature couldn't puncture it. In the margin of the photocopy in her handwriting was that same phrase, Veritas Vincit. I returned everything to its place, locked the cabinet and relocked the office door with the same pick, reversing the procedure while my mind raced. Back in my room, I lay awake and considered my next move. I needed an ally with the authority to pull the trigger, and Garrison's firm was clearly that ally. The next morning, I borrowed Vanessa's SUV under the pretext of grocery shopping, still needing her approval for the keys because the charade demanded I remain the fragile sister. I drove to a gas station 3 towns over, bought a prepaid burner phone with cash, and called Mr. Garrison's private line from a little wall phone in the station's dusty waiting area. When I identified myself and recited my mother's full name, date of birth, and the code phrase Veritas Vincit, the secretary put me through immediately. Garrison's voice softened when he heard me. He said, "Your mother told us you'd call when you were ready. We've been monitoring the county recorder's office. Your brother's forged transfer was filed 6 weeks ago. The trap has already sprung, Claire, but we need you to be the one to pull the pin on the grenade. The tape gives us grounds, but we need current evidence of his active fraud to secure a felony indictment, evidence that proves he's operating the scheme currently, not just planning it. Can you get us inside his computer? We need correspondence between him and the notary, bank records, and the original digital documents with metadata intact. Metadata timestamps are gold in a courtroom. I told him I could, and I meant it. What followed was a masterclass in patience and misdirection. Garrison's team, operating out of a trust department that felt more like an intelligence service, equipped me with a tiny USB device, a keystroke logger and drive imager disguised as a standard thumb drive. It was hidden inside a hollowed-out tube of my own lip balm, the kind that twists from the bottom, so I could keep it in my pocket without suspicion. The drive would install silently, log every keystroke, and then automatically copy all documents, spreadsheets, and email archives to a hidden storage partition while leaving no trace in the file directory. I waited for my moment. It came 2 nights later when Mark and Vanessa announced they were attending a charity gala, the kind of event designed to posture among people they wanted to impress while their debts stacked up like cordwood. Vanessa spent an hour choosing her gown, a gold sequin thing that cost more than most engagement rings, and she chattered about the silent auction and the after-party, confirming they would be gone for at least 4 hours. I helped her choose matching earrings, a pair of crystal chandeliers that I knew were cubic zirconia, but I smiled and said they were stunning. The moment the Escalade's taillights disappeared down the driveway, I moved. I entered the office again, this time with the confidence of someone who had already defeated the lark, the pick slipping into the keyway like an old friend. I booted his desktop computer, an older Windows machine that hummed to life with a chorus of grinding fans, the hard drive clicking with the effort. I knew from a slip of conversation weeks ago, when Mark had barked at Vanessa that the streaming login was his football number, that his password was his high school jersey number 42. I typed Mark 42, and the screen unlocked with a jaunty chime. The desktop was a clutter of shortcuts and unorganized folders, a digital reflection of his chaotic mind, icons overlapping like a bad collage. I inserted the USB device into a rear port where it would be invisible behind the monitor, its blue activity light hidden. The drive script ran silently, first installing a keystroke logger in the background that would capture every password, search query, and typed message for the next 2 weeks, then performing a rapid directory crawl, copying all documents, spreadsheets, and email archives to its hidden storage partition. While it worked, I opened his email client and searched for terms like notary, loan, and terrace holdings. I found a chain of emails between Mark and a man named Derek, the notary from his gym, discussing the fraudulent stamp with a casualness that turned my stomach. In one message, Mark wrote, "Just bring your seal to the store, I'll have a document ready. Same deal as last time, cash under the table. Make sure the stamp impression is clean this time, the last one smudged." Another thread contained scanned bank statements showing the loan proceeds being wired into an account at a regional bank I didn't recognize, then moved offshore to a shell company in the Caymans within 48 hours, a classic layering scheme. I copied each email to a separate folder I created on his desktop called Insurance, just to see if he'd ever find it, then I packed that folder into the USB dump as well. 17 minutes in, the drive's light blinked green, signaling completion. I pulled it out, shut down the computer, and relocked both the filing cabinet and the office door. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard the faint crunch of tires on gravel and froze, my pulse spiking, but it was only the neighbor's teenage son, turning around in the cul-de-sac, the bass of his music thumping for a moment before fading. I still had time, and I intended to use it. During my earlier daytime observations, I had noticed that Vanessa kept a locked jewelry box on her vanity in the master bedroom, a cheap velvet thing with a little brass clasp, but it was the kind of box that screamed costume jewelry so loudly no one would think to look deeper. I had glimpsed it when she'd asked me to fetch her phone from the nightstand, and I'd seen the edge of it through the half-open door. That night, while they danced under crystal chandeliers, I picked the bedroom door lock, a simple bathroom privacy lock that yielded to a thin flat tool in seconds, and approached the vanity. The jewelry box was unlocked, as expected, full of tangled chains and chunky earrings. But beneath the top tray, which lifted out with a practiced motion, I found a small velvet pouch containing my mother's sapphire pendant, the one she'd worn every anniversary dinner, the one she'd left to me in a separate letter I'd found in her safe deposit box. The sapphire was a deep Ceylon blue, a cushion cut, and I knew its inclusions like I knew my own fingerprints because I had cleaned it for her 100 times. It was warm in my hand, a piece of my mother that Vanessa had stolen before the body was cold. Rage flared, but I forced it down. I returned the pendant to its hiding place, photographed the position with my phone, and left everything exactly as I'd found it. This was another data point, another chit to cash in, and I would not blow my cover for a piece of jewelry, no matter how sacred. I locked the bedroom door behind me, and my hands were steady as I pocketed the USB. I had enough now to burn their house of cards to ash. I delivered the USB to Garrison the next day at a coffee shop near the courthouse, a little place with sticky tables, and a barrister who was too tired to care about two people huddled over a tablet. He slipped the drive into a tablet case lined with RFID shielding and nodded once. "We'll have the forensic accountant parse this within 72 hours, he said. "Her name is Patricia, and she's a former IRS agent who can smell a shell company like a shark smells blood. In the meantime, the trust's tripwire is primed. The moment we present evidence to the DA, the assets freeze automatically, and the bank that holds the bridge loan will be legally barred from foreclosing because they'll be on notice of the fraud. Your brother's entire financial house of cards will collapse, and he'll be standing in the middle of the wreckage with forged signatures in his own handwriting." I sipped my coffee, black, and felt the cold burn of anticipation. The next phase demanded a proof of character I could not unsee. I needed to know if there was any scrap of humanity left in my brother, any flicker of conscience I might appeal to before the end. So I staged a test. I had noticed that Mark's morning routine included a frantic call to his loan officer at exactly 8:15, a call he would never miss, a call where he paced and begged for extensions, his voice climbing octaves. He took that call in his office with the door closed, but I could hear the muffled cadences through the vent. One morning I positioned myself in the hallway that connected the guest suite to the kitchen, the narrowest corridor in the house, a choke point of parquet flooring and bad lighting. I weighted my back against the wall until I heard his office door open and his footsteps approach, the distinct heel-first beat I knew. Then I clutched my chest, let out a small, choked gasp, and crumpled sideways against the wall, sliding down with a thud that I made sure was loud, my shoulder hitting the floor first. I splayed my legs and let my breath go shallow, my face turned toward the baseboard. The terror of the past weeks was raw enough to make my skin clammy without even trying. I heard his footsteps stop. I imagined him rounding the corner, seeing me on the floor, my body a crumpled karma. I waited for him to kneel, to reach for his phone to dial 911, to show one shred of concern. Instead, his footsteps continued, and I felt the shadow of his body pass over me as he stepped over my legs. Not around them, but over them, his loafer brushing my calf with a casual contact, and he muttered, "Not now, not now." He grabbed his briefcase from the kitchen counter, and I heard the garage door open and close. His voice, already back on his phone, drifted back through the vent. "Listen, I need an extension. I have the signature today." I lay there for a full minute, the cold seeping into my hip bones, the smell of floor wax filling my nose, and I felt the last thread of familial loyalty snap. When his car engine faded, I stood up, brushed off my pants, and I knew. He had not called an ambulance. He had not checked on me when he returned that evening, instead asking me casually at dinner how my day was, as if I hadn't been crumpled on the floor that morning, as if my existence was simply an obstacle to be stepped over. I smiled and said, "Uneventful." The confrontation was engineered with the precision of a Swiss chronograph. Garrison's team coordinated with the Financial Crimes Division of the District Attorney's Office, and they asked me to hold off until the final piece fell into place. That piece arrived on a Thursday when the bank's final notice letter landed in Mark's mailbox, the one that said the store would be seized in 96 hours unless the title was cleared. Mark and Vanessa cornered me in their living room, and this time the masks were off. The bridge loan was due in 4 days, and the lender had already engaged a local law firm to initiate foreclosure. If they couldn't produce the title free and clear, the entire loan would be called, and their own house, a house I now knew was cross-collateralized like a house of cards, would be seized. Mark's voice was a blade wrapped in silk. "Claire, it's time. We need you to sign the release. It's just a formality to settle probate. Mom would want you to be taken care of to not have to worry about all this business stuff." He placed a thick stack of papers on the coffee table, the same glass table, and I could see the faint ring where my drugged tea mug had rested weeks before. The stack included a quitclaim deed, a release of all claims against the estate worded so broadly it would waive my right to sue for fraud, and a consent to the sale of the store's entire inventory at auction. They had even hired a mobile notary, an older woman with a rolling bag who was already setting up on their dining table, her seal and journal neatly arranged. I looked at her and saw the faint bulge of a wire under her jacket, a confirmation that she was the DA's plant Garrison had mentioned. I allowed myself a small, sad smile. "I need to see the store one last time before I sign," I said. "For closure." Mark's eye twitched, a tiny spasm, but Vanessa nodded vigorously. Closure was her favorite word, the hollow currency of their fake empathy. They drove me to the blocky brick building that held Beacon Hill Estate Jewelers, its windows dark, a for sale by owner sign already taped inside the glass, the ink bleeding from the heat. The bank officer from the commercial lender was waiting there, a man named Ridley who looked uncomfortable in his suit, along with 2 men in suits who I knew were from Garrison's firm, and a detective from the DA's office in a rumpled blazer, all hidden in the store's back office where the old Mosler safe stood, its combination still known only to me. The shop smelled of dust and disuse, the display cases empty and forlorn, the velvet padding torn out in some places where they'd already tried to strip value. Mark led me to the front counter, the same glass counter where I had helped 1,000 brides choose wedding bands, where I had appraised heirloom brooches for teary-eyed granddaughters, where my mother had stood for 40 years. He handed me a heavy silver pen, my mother's pen, the one with her initials, and pointed to a signature line highlighted with a yellow arrow. "Just sign here, Claire, then you can rest." I looked at the pen, its familiar weight in my hand, and then at him. I set it down on the glass countertop, the click echoing in the empty showroom. "No," I said. "Some signatures can't be forged because they are written in truth, and I won't stain this counter with a lie. I learned from Mom, you never forged a signature she couldn't spot." His face contorted, purple creeping up his neck, but before he could speak, the door behind me swung open, and Mr. Garrison stepped out, flanked by the detective. "Mark Terrence, you are under arrest for forgery, fraud, perjury, and uttering a forged instrument," the detective said, calm as a diamond grader reciting the 4 C's. Mark's face went the color of old ivory as he finally understood. Vanessa shrieked something about entrapment, her composure shattering like cheap glass, but the notary, who was already reading him his rights from a laminated card, ignored her. The store's front door buzzed, and 2 uniformed officers appeared, their polished shoes clicking on the tile. Mark twisted away at the last second, lunging toward the back door, his loafers slipping on the dusty floor, but the detective's hand caught his collar and spun him back before he made 2 steps. I saw the cuffs go on, the double lock mechanism clicking into place, and I felt the weight of 2 decades lift incrementally from my shoulders. The legal aftermath played out over a year, longer than I'd expected but shorter than he deserved. Mark was convicted on 7 felony counts, including perjury before the grand jury that investigated the notary conspiracy, a charge that carried its own weight. The video from that tiny high-8 tape was played in court on a large screen, his slurred confession echoing off the oak-paneled walls while he sat rigid at the defense table. His lawyer's objections overruled one after another because the chain of custody was impeccable. I saw the jury watch the timestamp and then look at Mark, and I knew they were doing the math. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation, 1,500 hours of community service, and full restitution of the embezzled funds, a sum that eventually totaled over $300,000 once the forensic accountant untangled his shell company and traced the money to an account in Georgetown. The store reverted to me by operation of the trust's ironclad clause, and every single fraudulent lien was voided within 48 hours of the asset freeze order. The bridge loan lender went after Mark's personal assets with a vengeance, forcing a short sale on the McMansion, which sold for less than the mortgage balance, leaving him with a deficiency judgment that followed him like a shadow. Vanessa left him within 3 months, taking their remaining furniture and the leased Escalade before the repo man could find it, and she was last seen working the returns counter at a department store, her Instagram deleted. A bankruptcy judge later described his financial conduct as a Ponzi scheme built on air and arrogance, and the ruling was published in the local paper. I rebuilt the store with my mother's name burned into every new display case. I commissioned a hand-painted sign in gold leaf above the door, and my new business cards were thick cream stock with the name forged in Greed Jewelers embossed in deep burgundy, the letters slightly raised so you could feel them with your thumb. But the true crown of my vindication came when I offered Mark a position as part of his court-ordered community service. It was a carefully structured arrangement, approved by the judge after I explained that the work would allow me to monitor his restitution directly. So now, 5 days a week, my brother sits at a bench in the back room, under a bright swing-arm lamp that casts a circle of light on a felt-lined work surface. To his left is a stack of tarnished platters and flatware awaiting restoration, and to his right a jar of rouge, the same red polishing compound I taught him to apply, though his technique is clumsy and he leaves swirl marks. He wears a tie I had specially made for him, black silk with gold embroidery that reads Heir of Deception in an elegant serif font. I require it as part of the dress code, a uniform that reminds everyone who walks through the back who he is and what he did. Next to his bench is a small plaque that lists his court case number and the crimes, a public notice that this is not just a job but a sentence. Every appraisal certificate that my shop produces, when it feeds through the laser printer onto heavy cream stock with a watermark of scales, includes a small print footnote at the bottom. This valuation is guaranteed accurate and honest, unlike the representations of Mark Terrence, convicted of forging his own inheritance. Case #CF 2024-00142. I sign each one myself, with that same silver pen, and it never warbles. I still keep that high 8 tape in a safe deposit box at the bank, alongside the note my mother wrote, the brass key from the armoire resting on top. The key opens a drawer where her original trust sits, embossed with the seal of the firm that protected me long after she was gone. My mother knew that love is not blind, that it must be armored with foresight, and she forged a shield out of legal language and a nanny cam hidden in a potted plant. Now when I walk through my shop past the gleaming showcases and the soft hum of the ultrasonic cleaner, I hear the faint rhythm of the polishing wheel from the back room, a sound like a clock ticking toward a long overdue justice. I never speak to him beyond the necessary instructions, and he never meets my eyes. But every customer who reads the footnote asks the same question: is that for real? I just smile and I say, every word. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me your story in the comments below. If you believe that truth always exposes a counterfeit, no matter how well hidden, hit like and subscribe for more stories of justice served with surgical precision and a touch of poetic repayment. Until next time, keep your valuables close and your family's paperwork closer.